About 5 years ago, our family was headed to Colorado Springs for vacation. We had joined the rest of civilized society. We had our GPS, but for some reason, we also had printed directions off MapQuest.com. So we get in the car, and MapQuest said, go out here to Interstate 44, go up to I-40, and head west. And so that's what we were going to do. But as soon as we're getting on I-44, TomTom speaks. And TomTom says, we're going the wrong direction, that we need to take I-35. Now, Robin asked the question, which way do you want to go? And my answer probably was not helpful. my answer was, I don't care which way we go. I'm on vacation. I should not have to make big decisions right now. This is what I'm wanting to do. I said, you can decide, and you've got 8 miles to do it. And she said, 8 miles? I said, that's how far it is till we get to I-40, where we either turn left and follow MapQuest, or we keep going until we intersect with I-35. Now, inquiring minds, I do want to know, we took I-35, so I'll get that. Don't want you to be distracted during the sermon. But I am one of those people, even when I'm on vacation, even though I'm supposed to be relaxing, I want to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. In fact, I would just kind of like to see a show of hands for how many people would like to get from point A to point B as fast as legally possible, I should say. Okay, I thought I probably wasn't the only one. And if you're like that, there's a story about how the people of God leave their slavery in Egypt and they're headed to the promised land. And at first sight, it just doesn't make sense. Because if they take the direct route from Egypt to the promised land, it takes them the better part of a week, 4, maybe 5 days. But we know the story, and of course it's not the only reason. It took them 40 years. What do we call that? The scenic route, right? The scenic route. I want to put this on a map because I want you to see this. And as I said, I actually have technology. I got my little laser pointer here. All right. Right here. That's Ramsesville. All right. That's where they were. And the direct route is right up this line. But the purple arrow is the route they took. Wow. Do you know why? Let's read about it. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went out of Egypt armed for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Brothers and sisters, this is the word of the Lord. Okay, so if anybody in here was thinking the reason that they took the scenic route was Moses was a man and he wouldn't ask for directions, that is not the case, all right? There's really a reason, because if you listen closely to the story, what you understand, Moses is not the leader on this trip. God is the leader. A cloud during the day, a pillar of fire by night. God is leading them along the way. Okay, now catch into this, because this is what we need to think about as we go forward. Every person in here, and really every person not in here, God has plan and purpose for your life. God has designed for how He wants to use your life to bring glory to His Son, Jesus Christ, how God intends to use you in this mission of making disciples. And oftentimes when we know God has called us to do something, our way would be to go from point A to point B as quickly as we can, taking the direct route. But God's plan for using us is probably not the same as our plan for being useful to God. We may want to get there quickly. God may have something different in store for us. Let me give you just a quick example of this. I want you to imagine, if you're able to imagine, I want you to imagine that God speaks into your heart and God tells you, I want you to be the person that goes to this small village in rural China. And you're going to go there and you're going to share the good news of my gospel. The direct route would be buy a plane ticket, get your visa, get your passport, arrange for ground transportation, and go to this little provincial town in rural China. Not a good plan. Not a good plan. A better plan would be, well, I'll just suggest two things that could make the plan better. The first, learn the language. Whether it's Mandarin or Chinese or some local dialect that they might speak, learn the language. And the second thing is learn the culture. Learn about this place God is calling you to go. God is calling you to do it, but God has to get you ready. I mean, there are times when God calls us to do something that God acts in an instant. Boom, we're there. It happens. But so many other times when God calls us to do something, that's not how God works. In fact, the people of Israel, when they're getting ready to make this journey, they're not ready to receive the promised land. They're not ready to battle the peoples that live in this land that they're going to have to go to war with. And most importantly, their faith is not strong enough. Hear that? Because if God calls you to do something, God's going to do something to strengthen your faith. So that when you're doing this thing for God, your faith is strong enough. Imagine that God was calling you to teach children's Sunday school, to share the good news there. I know immediately what a lot of people are thinking. I don't even like kids. I mean, we think it's important that we have them. I barely got through with my own. I don't like it, or I don't know the Bible well enough, or and if you don't know the Bible well enough, teach the Bible to children. You'll begin to learn it yourself. But God's got to have another plan. I don't feel prepared. I don't feel adequate. I don't feel equipped to do this. Well, if God's going to call you to do it, God's going to help equip you to do it. Or imagine that God says, hey, I want you've got a brand new neighbor. I want you to go knock on their door, and I want you to invite them to church. I would suggest to you that just going up and knocking on their door and saying, hi, I'm from St. Andrews. You want to come to church? Is not the best way to do it because you don't know them. It could be that in that moment, they explode into a rant about how hypocritical the church is and about how bad church people are and how they've been treated by Christian people. They might just go off. Is your faith strong enough to handle that? I think a better plan would be to get to know them, to build a relationship with them, to begin to pray, God, you want me to do this? Help me to see that open door, that window of opportunity to make an invitation when you know their heart is ready for it. God sometimes moves in an instant, but it seems like so many times God doesn't. And when God calls us to do something, we want to be faithful, but in order to prepare us, it seems like God is always going to take us through the desert. He's going to take us on the scenic route. And here's what I want us to know about the desert. The desert is the place of testing your faith. It is the testing ground of our faith. Think, before Moses leads the children of Israel into the promised land, what does Moses do? He has his years of exile in the desert where he meets his wife, where he's tending his father-in-law's sheep. Or how about Jesus? That's a better role model. Before Jesus really begins his public ministry, what do we read in the Gospels? 40 days. Jesus spent where? In the desert. The testing ground to show that he was going to be ready to do what God has called him to do. If it happened to Moses and it happened to Jesus, I think it's pretty safe to say we ought to expect it to happen to us. Now, you don't have to agree with that because you may not fully understand it, but give me a moment and I'll get there for you, okay? Everybody take a deep breath. And here's something I want you to know about the testing of your faith. There's only two possible outcomes. When your faith is tested, it will go one of two ways. I have found no third option. It will go one of two ways. You either pass the test or you do not pass the test. Now, I know we've got school teachers and recovering school teachers in here, and teachers would think, well, yeah, you get some students that pass, but I mean, they just barely pass. You got the ABCD grading scale. Hey, D- is a passing grade. Not at my house, but everywhere else. D- it is not a failure. It's not an F, right? You either pass or you fail. Whether you pass with flying colors is a different story, but you pass or you fail. When your faith is tested, that's how it's going to go. You will either pass or you will fail. And you're going to have your faith tested. God is going to call you to be used in this plan and purpose God has for helping you to bring glory and honor to Him. You're going to pass or fail. And the desert's a place that's going to be tested. So here's a few things you need to know about this desert business. The first thing is this. The desert is a place of threat. I know you were expecting some good news, weren't you? The desert is a place of threat. When the people of God are going through the desert, there is threat that is out there. And there's a good chance that when you go through the desert, that you might fail. And if you fail, this is hard to say, you might lose your faith. You ever been challenged that way? You ever had your faith tested to the point you thought you were going to lose it? It's what happens to the children of Israel. Now, I mean, just imagine for a second. It said God did not take them on the direct route. God did not take them through this land because it was occupied by the Philistines. Now, when you read the Old Testament, you know the Philistines and God's people didn't always get along. They fought a lot, okay? And so, if you're a Philistine, I know this is hard, but imagine you're a Philistine for just a moment, and you're a warrior people. You're a people that will go to battle. You do not fear anyone. And all of a sudden, you get the word that there is a nation of people, hundreds of thousands of people armed for battle, because that's what the scripture said. And they said, hey, we just want to pass through your land to get to the place God promised us. Hundreds of thousands of people armed for battle, and you think we're so naive that we're just going to let you pass through? No. What are the Philistines going to do if the people of God move that direction? They're going to fight. They're going to go to war. And God's not really afraid of the Philistines, but God is concerned about what happens to His people when they go to battle. And the word that it said was that when they get to battle, they start to lose. They may want to go back to Egypt. Now hear that clearly, friends. God's called you to do something with your life. God's called you in a way to serve Him. And your faith gets challenged and you're threatened. You may just think, God, I didn't sign up for this. I said I'd serve you, but I didn't think it meant going to the desert. No, God, that's not at all what I had planned. I've got a good friend, Kyle. Maybe his story will help you understand this a little better. Kyle was one of my college students. In his freshman year of college, we had a music ministry that traveled around, and I was invited to preach in Keys, Oklahoma, out in the Panhandle. Now, there's also a Keys over by Fort Gibson. Don't get the two confused. One has a lot of water, the other doesn't. Keys, Oklahoma, and I'm preaching, and during this experience, Kyle feels like God is calling him to give his life to full-time Christian service. He imagined at that point that he would be a worship leader because that's what he really loved. He loved leading worship. He loved helping to get people in a place where spiritually their lives were connecting with God. That's what he loved to do. And this happened Kyle's freshman year. So we come back sophomore year, and Kyle is just bugging me. He is bugging me to let him take over leading worship at the campus ministry. And it's like, Kyle, we're doing this together. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. He goes, man, I can do this. I promise you. Just let me do it. I've got some great ideas. It'll be great. And you know what happens when people bug you enough? Sometimes you give in. And so I said, okay, next week you're going to lead worship. He thought it was the greatest thing ever. He came in and he said, okay, we're going to get rid of the screen. We don't want people to focus on the words we're singing. We want people to be able to shut their eyes and connect with God and be moved in worship. And he said, I picked out all this music. I've got this set, and it's going to get us to that place. And I said, okay. And the next day, Kyle came in my office. He was not a complete, utter failure, but he knew he had failed. He said, I thought everybody would know those songs. And nobody knew those songs. And we didn't have the words, so nobody could sing those songs. And this is what I told him. I said, Kyle, we don't put the words up there just to remind us. That's not what the words are up there for. The words are up there so that anybody who comes can participate in what we're doing. I mean, that's why we put the words up here. That's why we put sermon notes up here. That's why we put the Apostles' Creed up here. I mean, you might have that one memorized, but the others are pretty tough, aren't they? Or you might not know this because you're praying. You probably have your head bowed, but every Sunday we pray the Lord's Prayer. The words are on the screen. Did y'all know that? It's not for those of you that know it. It's for anybody here that doesn't. And that's what I had to help him understand was we do these things so that people can participate in what we're doing. And what he learned more than anything was that he still had a lot to learn. And I'll tell you, he learned it well. Kyle went on to become a worship leader in churches for a number of years. He was a worship leader down at Journey Church. And now he's on staff at one of the largest churches in the United States. The thing that could have happened to him was the first time he got to take charge and he failed, he could have said, Lord, I didn't sign up for this. I'll just go back to my church because I know everybody there knows these songs. Lord, we'll just do. He could have said, God, I did not sign up for this. He could have allowed the threat of failure to overtake him and run away from that. But friends, the desert is not just a place of threat. The desert is also a place of promise. Every threat that they're going to encounter in the desert, God's going to meet for them. And understand where we read the story. They just left Egypt. They haven't yet gotten to the Red Sea where they see a sea in front of them and Pharaoh's army behind them. They haven't seen God part the waters. They haven't seen the dry land that they walk across. They haven't seen God defeat Pharaoh's army. They saw the plagues. You know, they knew God kept them safe. That was really cool because the Egyptians were mean. But imagine what kind of things that you would encounter in the desert. If you were traveling through a desert, what would you expect? Anybody expect to get thirsty? And yet, when they got thirsty, God provided water for them to drink. How about when they got hungry? God would provide for them. In the face of that threat, God's promise came true. If they had to face any people in battle, if they did what God said, they were successful in the battle. Every time God calls us to do something, there will be a test of our faith. And if we fail, we will feel threatened. But if we can understand what God is doing, we will receive the promise. Because our faith is showing that we are ready to receive what God is calling us to receive. See, the reason the desert is a place of promise is because with all the threats that are out there, the desert is a place of promise because we have to be utterly dependent upon God. There is no water. God provides. There is no food. God provides. And don't get any more than you're going to eat today. Just get enough for today because tomorrow God's going to provide again. A good friend of mine helped me to understand this in seminary. His name was David Foxworth. Dave was a Carolina boy. Big fan of ACC basketball and the Dallas Cowboys. Next to loving Jesus, that was the only thing that redeemed him in my book. And Dave, back in the day, Dave was older than I was. Back in the day, Dave had been a weed-smoking hippie. Before he came to faith in Christ, that's who he was. And when he came to faith in Christ, it changed his life. He actually went on staff at his church, wasn't a United Methodist church. He came out of the charismatic, independent church kind of movement. And they had put him on staff. He was the associate pastor in this small church. And, you know, he wasn't going to make a living doing that. And so he came to seminary there at ORU, and the only job he could find was minimum wage work study. And minimum wage is not living wage. And so he struggled. I mean, he struggled. What he made from his work study job paid his rent, but there wasn't much left to pay his bills. There certainly wasn't much left to buy food. And there was one Friday I was coming home to Oklahoma City, wanted to see Robin, wanted to see my family. And I asked Dave before I left, I said, man, do you have enough food to eat this weekend? Because I've got some food in my apartment. I'll be glad to get you some. And he said, I'll be okay. I've got some peanut butter and jelly. Y'all been in that shit? That's my answer to how we get 2 tons. Quit buying ramen noodles. Buy peanut butter. It's heavier. So he told me he was going to be okay, but that weekend I was just kind of distracted, wondering how he was doing. And I went to my church that Sunday, and I told some people, asked them to pray for this friend of mine who didn't have enough money to buy food. And, of course, you know, people are generous, and people began to give me money. Would you give this to him? Would you give this to him? And then my dad was working in a food distributing company at the time, and when I came home, I always went and raided his truck so I would have food to eat. And I got some extra for Dave. I went back to Tulsa, and I saw Dave, and I had this bag of food. I said, hey, Dave, I wanted to give this to you. No words, no expression. He grabbed the bag and ran into his apartment. The next day when I saw him, I said, if you hadn't run off, I'd have given you this money too. And he said, DA, he goes, I'm sorry. He goes, I didn't even thank you for that. He goes, I'm grateful for that. He goes, I was starving. I was starving and I was hungry. And when I saw that food, all I could think of was eating. He said, I'm truly grateful. And I said, well, David, I didn't provide this for you. God has provided this for you. And I've always remembered what his response was. He said, you really don't know what it means to pray, give us this day our daily bread, until you don't have any bread. He was utterly dependent upon God. That is the hardest place our faith will ever be tested. Brothers and sisters, God has called you to do something with your life. And not to do it for yourself, to do it for him. And God's going to take you to the desert because he knows that you're not ready to get directly to that place that he wants you to be. I don't care if this happens to you as an individual. It happens to us as a church. Sometimes to get where we want to go, we have to prove that we're ready to do what God's called us to do. We have to get things together, and our faith will be tested, and it will be hard. It will not be fun, but it will be good for us. And when we pass the test, then the promise of God is known. I want to share one more thing about the desert, and then we're going to invite you to the Lord's table. The desert, the journey through the desert, is life-defining. When Moses got ready to leave, we read where it said he took Joseph's bones with him. Now that may just seem kind of funky, and why is it in there? But there's a reason. Joseph had lived hundreds of years before Moses. Moses had never met Joseph, but Moses knew that Joseph was a servant of God. And Joseph, who had become second in Egypt, Pharaoh's number one, Joseph is number two. And Joseph knew that his great-grandfather Abraham had been given the promise of God to move into a land that they would call their own. And so when Joseph dies, he makes everybody swear an oath that you will not leave me here in Egypt. When you go to the place that God is calling our people to go, you will take my bones and you will bury them there. He did not want his identity. He did not want the thing that defined his life to be that he was an Egyptian. He wanted it to be that he was an heir to the promise of God through the covenant that God had offered. when we come through the desert, when we receive the promise of God, brothers and sisters, it lets us know who we are. It defines our lives. So let's go to the desert. Don't be afraid. Arm yourselves. Be ready for danger and struggle. And be ready to watch God prevail.